Hello again, everyone. In lieu of the absence of our host, I am going to introduce the next presentation and the presenter. She is a fellow colleague in the Department of Hispanic Studies, a fellow of the doctoral program in creative writing, and also a fellow at Arte Público, as am I, where we both are working on the recovery projects of the Hispanic U.S. So with us is Carolina Suarez.
Okay, so we are so happy to be here today. First, I want to say so sorry for my English. Like Celia Cruz said one time, my English is not very looking, but I'm going to do my best. Entonces, so this presentation we want to make because we want to recognize the efforts of Centro Aztlán that's doing from all of these years here in Houston to the community Latino. So all this collection that you see there, sorry, this was there, but all the collection that today we have here of the collection of Centro Aztlán, we have housed at the recovery program of the University of Houston at Arte Público. So feel free to, if you want to go to see some of them, you can do it. And okay, so I don't know if you know what is Centro Aztlán, but Centro Aztlán is a community center service that try to safeguarding the dignity, the culture, and safeguard the culture of the Latino here in Houston. So what they look at is that all the community have many problems too. The migrant state, the healthcare, and many things like they feel the Latino very abandoned by the governments and all of those. So 12 students of the University of Houston decided to organize and make strategies to help Latinos communities. So they try to inform, educate, and also they do something very important, and that was that, you know, when people move from here, from another country to here, and they have to migrate, they lost many roots of the original culture. So they can speak the same language, so they have to speak here English, and they have to lose many things, like their food, they fest, the traditional, I don't know, the traditional celebrations. So they decided to help all the Latinos, and especially the Mexican community, I'm gonna focus in two important events that they have. The first one is the carnival of the Halloween carnival and the haunted house. What this is so important for them because, you know, in Mexico, they have a big celebration, traditional celebration, that's called in Spanish, el Día de los Muertos, and in English is the Date of the Deads. So what they try to do is to connect two events. One of them was Halloween parties, and the other ones the Date of the Dead. And they want to make all the community come together and bring the kids and bring the teens with them in order to the kids and teens don't be around on the streets and with all the danger that can be there. So they organized big parties. This was a huge parties, and the effort that the community do was huge because of two reasons. They tried to reach big brands like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and of these brands to help the community with some products, with some donations, and also they try to make all the community together and donate time. So they can recreate like this Death of the Dead and make the community together again and try to make like feeling home, feel with family. So they make this till we have in our collection till 1979 to I think 2000. Maybe they did more, but we don't have the records here. So we have these two small that you have see there and you have there in your hands. They are the examples of the flyers that Community Center did, like very hand manual. So they cut the ghost, the monsters, and they stitch on the papers. They create everything and they start in zero. So this is a really effort that they do to create. This event have like 2,000 people around. They are huge. I want to picture there. And the second event that I want to talk about is Conjunto Fest. I don't know if you know what is Conjunto. You know what is Conjunto? No? Well, if some of you don't know what is Conjunto, Conjunto is a genre of música norteña. This music norteña is a mix that produced when the turn of the century with the working Mexican Texas class. They start to play and they try to bring their roots with the music, but they mix it with Texas and with some polka and of rhythms, different rhythms. So they mix and create a new music that is from Texas really, but is a mix Mexican Texas people. So it's very, very important for Houston to be aware of what this kind of gender is because born basically here. And so what happened with this music? This music have a problem, and is that, the most important instrument for they was the accordion. You know what is accordion, no? Is that the gentleman have there, the accordion, is a instrument that they was like fundamental and the key for produce all the music. And this is very important because the music industry here in Houston, they don't care about the conjunto was because it was no commercial and no important for people. So what they think about it was with Centro Astral coordinate an event, a huge event, the first one in their class in 1971 was the first one that they create this event, and they coordinate, and they want to bring all the musicians, local musicians, former musicians, leaders of the different community, and some people of televisions and radio to create like a committee that can curate the event and bring all these huge singers and give some light from them. So I want to put some music from them because I don't want to explain, I want you to listen from three important representatives of this music. So one is Domingo, that you see there. Domingo, there. Domingo Maldivar, I'm gonna play this music first, is him. So, this song called Rueda de Fuego, it's like fire wheel. And I'm gonna play other musician very important from here that was discovered by this Conjunto Fest, and his name was Rubén Vela. So the name of the song is El Coco Rayado.
Ese coco que quiere luz, de la palma lo arranco yo. Ese coco que quiere luz, de la palma lo arranco yo. Que sí, que sí.
And there was the last song is from the Los Aguilares, and the name is Anhelos. And they have a very interesting story because anyone wants to hear about them. So they make like lines to waiting for the radio to play this song. So they wait like 5 hours to go to speak with someone in the radio that could put some music of them in the radio to make this music like huge and for other audience different than the same people that hear this song. So, Los Aguilares, Anhelos. And this is the presentation. We really are honored to host the archival collection of the Centro Aztlán in recovery program of Arte Press in the University of Houston. And be free to come, and if you want to check some of the items that we have, feel free of them. Thank you so much for being here and for the patience.
Thanks for bearing with us. Thanks for coming to Old Weird Houston, and we've got our next guest in view, ready to go. All right, then I'm going to make an intro. We have with us Mike Vance. He's the author of 11 nonfiction books on Texas history, sports, and comedy. One brand new novel, and he has written, produced, and directed 8 feature-length Texas history documentaries and over 150 short education Texas history films. He also does the wildly irreverent American history podcast, Prick the Balloon. Mike has taught Houston and Texas history at Rice University's Glasscock School of Continuing Studies for more than a decade. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mike Vance.
All right, so I'm going to try to stand like this and not touch anything for the next 45 minutes. I did want to do the shameless plug for my website, and that's where you can find out more. It's MikeVanceWriter.com. So, oh, somebody's brave.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I like to make the audience go.
Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about, as you can see, or as you can't see, as you can see, that's me. But there's supposed to be a PowerPoint coming up here momentarily. I can see it on the computer. There we go. All right. It's titled Back When Crime Was Legal. And it's pretty much just what it says. We're going to start off in an area called Vinegar Hill. So if you can pull out your kind of mental Houston map, it's where the downtown aquarium is. And it's where the old Reasoner Street police station is. Only a handful of you look old enough to have been arrested and taken to Reasoner Street. But if you had, you would have been at Vinegar Hill. And this starts about the 1870s. So we're talking about right after the Civil War. It's a very different Houston. And the 1870s, talking about race relations, that was the time of probably greatest hope for the newly freed people that had been enslaved. And there was a lot more crossover in society than people think. So keep that in mind as we're going through our story. Queen Caroline Riley was, by the term of the day, mulatto, so mixed race. And the white press, and at that time, this is before even the Houston Post showed up. So we had the Houston Telegraph was still around, and there was a very brief-lived paper called the Houston Herald that was around. But Queen Caroline Riley was one of the few people that would make it into the white press. And she was a madam of a bordello in Vinegar Hill. But it went beyond that. She was really kind of the, as you can see, queen of Vinegar Hill. This is a picture, hard to see from there, but you're looking basically from Market Square, an aerial view toward the northwest. And where those little smokestacks are over there, that's kind of what we're talking about. So I'm going to read this to you. This came from a fire department history in 1915, and it is, honest to God, one of the most racist books on Houston history that you will ever find. It is available. You can find it in different places. But 1915, by that time, that hope that I had talked about had evaporated. And you were in hardcore Jim Crow at that time. And a lot of these firemen were Irish immigrants, or second generation Irish, first or second generation American Irish. And that mixing, that had gone away. So this is written by one of the fire department people who's trying to document this time period from the 1870s. He's talking about Caroline Riley. Very cunning and treacherous, and paid more toll into the recorder's court than all the balances of the Negroes of Houston combined for infractions of the law. Fines and imprisonment were not deterrent factors to Caroline when her iniquitous brain was in working order. Revelries with bad whiskey, trifling Negroes, and low-down white men were the order 6 out of 7 nights in the week. Saturday night was a prize occasion, and debauchery ran riot. Every base deed known to criminology has been credited to Vinegar Hill, and Caroline Riley was always one of the arrested parties. So this is a fireman writing this, but you can imagine that same kind of prose showing up by the 1880s in the Houston Post. So good news that happened in the black community, you didn't read about that in the white press. This kind of stuff, they jumped at the chance to print this. They talked about, this is a quote from the Houston Post, dusky nymphs. And they're talking about the women that worked for Caroline Riley. Bigfoot Jenny Johnson, Letitia Richmond, AKA Baby Elephant. So imagine Houston at this time with about 20,000 people when Vinegar Hill was really in full swing. And it's a small town. So about the size of Brenham now, if you can picture that. And people tend to know each other. So the white press is writing like, oh, this is a totally different world. But like I said, the crossover was large. This is a quote that came out in the last few years of her life, but it talked about seeing Queen Caroline Riley's face by, quote, kerosene lamp, and it bore fearful record of years of dissipation, sin, and crime. So you're getting the purplest of newspaper prose at that time. This is another story that was a Vinegar Hill story. They talked about hermaphrodite Dick Rogers, who was apparently a known person in the town at that point. And in one particular instance, he lured a tourist to Vinegar Hill, robbed him, and the police caught him at Queen Caroline Riley's house in Vinegar Hill, splitting up the money. They had stolen $300 from this guy from St. Louis, which in 1879 or so would have been significant cash. Well, the fire department that I was talking about, they would go down to Vinegar Hill, and these were wooden structures put together with probably found material in some cases. None of them were substantial houses. The fire department would go down there and set fires. Now, I should specify this is not the city-owned fire department yet. That didn't happen until 1895. So these are volunteer fire companies who are subsidized by the city. And they each kind of compete against each other. There's stories about the volunteer fire departments showing up and getting in fistfights because they would get tipped by the business owner or building owner to put out the fire. So you had different fire companies that would show up and start duking it out on the street while the building is burning to the ground to see which one of them is going to get the chance to put the fire out. So these are not necessarily the most reasonable guys that are showing up. Well, they would go down to Vinegar Hill and they would set fires in these little shacks. And then they would bring their hoses down, horse-drawn hose trucks, and basically wash these shacks into the bayou. So if you can picture where I'm talking about, by the downtown aquarium. The bayou goes right under those bridges down there. They would wash the shacks down into the water. And they're writing about this and bragging about it in 1915 when they wrote this history of the fire department. Eventually, Vinegar Hill went away, and they moved to an area called the Hollow, or Happy Hollow. And that was basically the theater district. So next time you're at the Wortham or the Hobby Center, you're in the red light district from about 1890 to about 1915. And it operated just fine. The city was happy to have it there until that became valuable property. And you think about, a city of 20,000 that's now 30,000 and 40,000. Well, it's spreading to the west, and that goes into the theater district up and down Louisiana Street and Smith Street, and that becomes really valuable property. So they move the red light district, and they move it to a neighborhood that they don't have to worry about, Freedmanstown. So what you're seeing here is a map of the reservation, and that's what it was called, and it was there from 1908 to 1917 as a legal entity. So the idea was during this progressive era that we're not going to get rid of prostitution. We're not going to get rid of vice, so we might as well put it in an area that it doesn't offend anybody. Well, it offended the people that were living there because they took their property. There were churches in this area, the little red outlined area, and they didn't care. It was a black neighborhood. So they moved the reservation there. They located these bordellos and bars and all kinds of every sin district sort of operation that you can imagine. Bottom of the red line there where it sticks down, that is San Felipe Street, which is today's West Dallas. So the north side of that, from West Dallas north to Buffalo Bayou, was where this reservation was. And it's largely today, the street grid is gone. It was turned into San Felipe Courts, part of it was, which became Allen Parkway Village at some point. So it's been various things. There are now some on Allen Parkway, some high-end apartment and condo places, of course, but the street grid is gone that you're seeing here. So the reservation in Houston, that was across Texas. This whole idea of a city-controlled and restricted red light district was in every city in Texas. The largest one was in San Antonio, because San Antonio at that time was the largest city in Texas. And it was called the Sporting District, but you had Hell's Half Acre in Fort Worth, Frogtown in Dallas, Guy's Town in Austin, the Flats in Corpus, the Bowery in Amarillo, and 2 Street in Waco. And I put up there that Waco was the most profitable in the state. The reason was that Waco was charging fees to go in and give health examinations to the women that worked there, and charging fees to the houses. So basically, Waco figured out a way to monetize the red light district, and they did a good job with it. So back to when I said about the mixed race society, the one place that never went away was in things like bordellos, in things like these cat houses, because you would have mixed race relationships going on in there, paid relationships. And that was nothing out of the ordinary. It was incredibly common. There's a story, though, out of Houston, out of that reservation, about a woman named Thelma Denton. And she was a black woman that owned and operated this house that had white women working as some of the hookers there. And that was what offended some of the judges. So there was one JP in particular, a justice of the peace named McDonald, that made it one of his quests to put her out of business. And there was a lawsuit. So Thelma Denton, the madam, actually took the judge to court, and she lost. But think about, this is ostensibly a legal operation that he's harassing. And she lost the court case. The interesting part is that her race changed between the census in 1910 and the census in 1920. By 1920, Thelma Denton still has the same house, same operation, same women working there in some cases, but Thelma Denton is now white in the census. So there was a real fluid kind of relationship going on while the city was busy looking the other way. What ended this officially was World War I. And this guy, Newton D. Baker, who was a pacifist, by the way, from Indiana, and a stand-up guy, by all accounts, a very progressive mayor from Indianapolis and had been a politician there in Indiana, became the Secretary of War. And he did not want the soldiers, the newly drafted soldiers, hanging around in these red light districts. So he got rid of them, at least on paper. Prohibition was the other thing that came along. And Texas fought prohibition for a long time. Other states had given in, they passed state laws. There were 5 attempts in Texas to pass a state prohibition law, and it didn't take. Enforcement was spotty. That is an understatement. Basically, if you picture the state of Texas from I-10 to Houston, 290 through Austin, Fredericksburg, where it joins back to I-10, and all the way to El Paso, the southern half of the state was heavily Catholic, Hispanic, or black. And those 3 voting blocks did not want prohibition. The northern part was heavily Baptist and Anglo, and they voted for prohibition. So 40 years before this, there had been a local option. The northern half of the state was dry, but if you look at the southern half of the state, it was really pretty spotty. And Houston did not become dry, for example, until the national amendment passed, and then everybody was out of luck. The picture here is from downtown Brenham. And the guy that's on the far right there on the back, and they have some stills that they have confiscated, is a guy named Bernie Parker, who was the sheriff of Washington County at the time. And he was a Klan member, a very upfront Klan member. But there are stories about Austin County, which is just immediately to the south of that, Austin County being Sealy and Belleville. Austin County had a German sheriff, and the Germans sure were not putting up with prohibition. So the federal government, the G-men, had come down to Austin County to raid a still operation down there, and the German sheriff's like, nope, you're on your own. So they went to Washington County and got Bernie Parker here to come down and raid an operation in Austin County. So when I say it was spotty, it depended on the sheriff and it depended on law enforcement. And if you ran afoul of them, even though all the other bars were open, you made the sheriff mad, you're in trouble. So, it's a question. One of the other houses that was in the reservation and stayed there well after World War I into the 1920s, operating just fine with nobody harassing it, was a house run by, and this has got to be the best hooker name of all time for Houston, Lucille Laporte. And Lucille, whose real name was Sadie Circum, her house finally was going to move. They were going to run it out of business, and a group of Houston politicians, and almost certainly Oscar Holcomb, who was the serial mayor of Houston, elected 5 different times between 1920 and 1957, JR? Does that sound right? At any rate, she moved her house, and it was underwritten by a bunch of Houston politicians, including the mayor. And they moved it over to the East End. Not far from here at all. It's out of business, so nobody make a note of I'll stop by there on the way home. It was on Capitol, and there were 2 buildings. There was a white house, white bordello, that was fairly large, and a smaller black bordello that catered to the chauffeurs of the rich white guys that came to visit the white place. And it operated over there for years. Probably about I'm guessing in the late 80s, maybe. there was a vending machine company, and I knew the guy that owned it. And they bought the property. The White House had been torn down, or was in the process of being torn down. And they had bought the property next door with the smaller house, the old black bordello on it. And they had to go clean out some stuff in the larger white one. And they said it still had these red velvet curtains. It was like a scene out of Miss Kitty's and Gunsmoke. And there was a giant painting of Lucille Laporte that was on the stairs. They said it was just, Hollywood set kind of stuff. And they cleaned that out. That house got torn down, but the other one remained. The other one is still there. And for a while, I don't know what it is now, but for a while, it was student housing, like off-campus student housing for U of H. So, not sure now, but I did know the couple that owned it, that had bought it and was leasing it out to these student houses. So it was, and this is another quote, a hush-hushed red light district of chandeliered magnificence and contrasting filth. A lot of judgment going on. Well, one of the women that worked for Lucille got sick, and she was a black woman with a child, and Lucille promised to take care of this child. So when the mom died, Lucille basically adopted this young girl named Vicey, and for her entire life, Lucille took care of her. And Vicey lived on. She kept a scrapbook that had pictures of the women that had worked at that house all the way back to the 1920s and 30s. Included a couple of well-known Houstonians that had come there as customers that were posing with the women in the scrapbook. So one of them was a chair of the UT Board of Regents at the time. So these are not inconsequential guys that are showing up at this place. And you can see here, Lucille, the house was finally closed in the 1960s, coincidentally after Oscar Holcomb was no longer mayor. Lucille died in 1985 and Vicey in 2004, but Lucille put Vicey through college, and she ended up going to the Air Force Academy and having a career in the military. So how are we on time, Pete? Another 10? Okay. I'll try to go through this. After Houston kind of shut down its operation, people went to Galveston. And Galveston remained just what you see here, a wide open city. The rules of the mainland don't apply. There had been a couple of gangs that operated in Galveston, and we're talking back into the 1910s, they did actually shoot one another. There were a couple of famous murders that happened there in Galveston. One of the coolest things was they had what they called Rum Row during Prohibition, and that was a line of boats that would be right at the territorial water limit, so 7 miles at the time off of the shore in Galveston, were a line of boats selling liquor. And people would go out in these fast speedboats to buy their liquor and then outrun anybody that might possibly be trying to chase them back to shore. So Prohibition, like I said, around here was never that much of a deal. The two people that you need to know about that really ran Galveston for a long time were Sam and Rose Maceo. Both of them arrived from Sicily about 1910, got jobs as barbers. Sam working at the Galvez and Rose at Murdoch's, which was, it's still there, I guess, but it's been a succession of these buildings on piers. They opened all of these clubs, these fancy clubs, during Prohibition, and they had such sway in Galveston with the politicians, nobody stopped them. This was their first, 1926, the Hollywood Dinner Club. This is the one I really, really wish I could have gone to, the Turf Athletic Club and the Turf Grill. I mean, that looks like a great place to hang out, right? But they had that, Market and 23rd. Upstairs at the Turf was the Studio Lounge, and that's where the gambling was. They had a private elevator that would take you up there. The most famous one started out being called the Sui Ren, and why they pronounced it with an R is beyond me, but it was on the seawall, and it became the Balinese Room. And the Balinese was there for a long time. took damage in Hurricane Carla, kind of got rebuilt, took more damage, and finally went away. But the Balinese was fantastic. And it's famous in the ZZ Top song, but it was just a great place. I had the good fortune to play the Balinese Room doing comedy a few times when it was like way down on its heels, but it was a cool place. They used to bring in all kinds of top flight entertainment, and here's the list here, but Frank Sinatra, Phil Harris, who was a well-known radio and early television guy, actually recorded an album there, and Duke Ellington, Glenn Miller, the top names in show business. Galveston really was Las Vegas before it became Las Vegas. They also had houses of prostitution up and down Post Office Street. If you talk to Galveston people that are today in their 80s and 90s, some of them might fess up to having gone there. The Maceo brothers were incredibly popular citizens because they gave back to Galveston. They put on a big celebration on Independence Day. They held an event called Splash Day, and they paid for all of it. Texas City disaster that happened in 1947, and several hundred people got killed. The Maceos were some of the biggest benefactors that held benefits and donated their own money to help out those families. They called it the Free State of Galveston, and the Maceos and the Moody family. So you're talking about the mob partnering with the most important family in Galveston to build this pleasure pier together. It was a joint venture of the Moodys and the Maceos. They had a mayor that showed up in the 50s named Herbert Cartwright, that is him over there on the right, and very young at the time he got elected, and he ran on the "we're running a regulated open town." That was his platform. So always going to be somebody to ruin the fun, right? And we had a couple of attorneys general, I guess, from the state of Texas, Price Daniel, and especially Will Wilson, that were just hell-bent on shutting down the city of Galveston. This is one of the great quotes. They had the sheriff of Galveston County show up there, and at a Senate hearing, they said, well, why have you've been sheriff 20 years, why have you not shut this down? He said, I can't get in, I'm not a member. And that was the attitude. But when the Texas Rangers would come out and try to do a raid, they had notice. As soon as they crossed the Galveston County line at Dickinson, people would call down to the Balinese and these other places and say Rangers are on their way. They had crap tables that turned over to become a regular table. They had roulette wheels that went up into the wall. And if all of that didn't work in time, as soon as the Rangers hit the front door of the Balinese, knowing that way down there is where the gambling was taking place, the band, whoever it was, would play The Eyes of Texas, and everybody would stand up and push their chairs back and start singing The Eyes of Texas and make it almost impossible for the Rangers to fight their way through the crowd and get back to the gambling area. They had a raid in 1949, didn't really work. Finally, in 1957, they succeeded in shutting down the operation in Galveston. And I'll end with Jakey Friedman, who started as a partner with the Maceos and then moved to Houston. And he was a partner in the Hollywood Club, their first operation, and then decided he would come run the operation up here. He is Carolyn Farb's grandfather, and she is very proud of him, as well she should be. He was a very important guy in Houston. He ran this club called the Domaine Privé, roughly South Main and Willow Bend. And it sat there for a long time. If you go back into historic Google Maps, you can find it. And you can even see after the building went away, the footprint of it that stayed there for quite a while. It had all kinds of gambling. People would show up and they would say, is Mr. Friedman in at the front gate? And if you were known, you came in and could do really, really high stakes gambling. So the cream of Houston was at Domaine Privé, losing tens of thousands of dollars on a given night. Well, when things got too hot in Houston, Jakey Friedman moved to Las Vegas and with a couple of other guys started the Sands Hotel back when Las Vegas was new and really coming together. So he was one of the absolute pioneers of the Vegas Strip. The Sands, by the way, was the Rat Pack's hotel. So Jakey was out there with Frank and Dean and Sammy and the guys. This was like really hardcore early Las Vegas. And that's where we'll end because I think I'm out of time. So thank you all very much. If anybody has any questions or anything, my table is out in the middle over there, and I have a bunch of books for sale, and stop by and visit. Thanks.
Y'all go buy some books from that man. Anybody ready for a whale tale? I just want to properly introduce Joy Oria. She's a graduate student at the University of North Texas pursuing a master's in library science with a concentration in archival studies. Hey, that's my alma mater. She previously worked at the Family History Research Center at the Houston Public Library, where she coordinated programming and outreach, provided reference service, and performed collection development. Her goal is to promote unique resources to a wider audience and encourage community participation and stewardship of heritage institutions. Hey, that's what this whole event is all about. She writes articles and gives presentations on Hispanic genealogy research topics to conferences, libraries, and societies. In her spare time, she enjoys reading historical mysteries, gardening for butterflies, and supporting the arts. Come on up here, Joy. Everybody's waiting for you. There she blows.
Hey, hi everybody. Thank you for being here today. And let me just take a look. Okay. All right. So this is the Port Arthur whale, and I would argue that whales are inherently interesting, but also the way that we perceive them has certainly changed over time. Now, growing up, I remember this Star Trek movie where the crew of the Enterprise with a couple of humpback whales saved the Earth from destruction. But also in our cultural lexicon is this vision of Moby Dick, a terrifying whale who drove Captain Ahab crazy and ultimately caused his destruction. Now, here at Houston, we don't really have in-person experiences with whales, at least not anymore. Because over 100 years ago, a touring sperm whale made its way to our fair city. Our story opens with the Houston Carnival Notsuoh that originated in 1899 and would last for 1 week every November. And its purpose was to promote commerce and tourism. It was sort of modeled after Mardi Gras. There were balls and parades, a king and a queen. The king was a prominent business leader, the queen a society debutante. And one of the characteristics of Notsuoh is things were spelled backwards. Notsuoh is Houston. And ultimately, Notsuoh met its demise when World War I came around. But in 1910, the festivities began with the arrival of King Notsuoh XII, backwards for cotton, on his ship coming down Buffalo Bayou. Now, the magazine Progressive Houston wrote, he disembarked at the foot of Main Street at high noon, amid the booming of great guns, the blast of 100 iron-throated whistles and huzzas from 1,000 human throats. For miles along the banks of his chosen waterway, thousands upon thousands stood to witness his coming and cheer when he came. He was accompanied by his courtiers on his royal flagship and the escorting fleet of 30 vessels. But also on the waterway of Buffalo Bayou that day was another attraction, a taxidermied sperm whale on a barge at the foot of San Jacinto Street. What was that visitor experience like? Well, we're going to have to use our imagination a little bit. This is the barge that held the whale, but you can see it was constructed to prevent free glimpses. The Houston Post reported, visitors inspected every side from 2 decks, then entered the whale through its mouth, stepping carefully between the teeth. Exit was through a door in one side. The interior could accommodate between 50 and 75 persons standing. Alongside the whale are the huge bones. And the interior not only shows the whale, but a number of specimens of alligators, fish, and interesting animal skeletons. And how big was the whale? Well, the Houston Chronicle wrote, an ordinary span of horses and a big wagon could have been driven through the whale without serious inconvenience. But what's an attraction without good press? The man who brought this all about, Captain Plummer, held a private preview meal for his friends before opening it up to the general admission. And of course, this was covered by the press. The Houston Post wrote, the luncheon was a delightful affair, besides being uncannily novel. It was very probably the first like affair in the world. Tables were placed on the roomy interior of the monster, and a light luncheon with refreshments served. The only odor was from cigars and the eatables. Not a vestige of any discomforting smell could be found by the visitors, who whiffed and sniffed every section of the mammal. Now, a newspaper in Keokuk, Iowa, added more detail. This was covered nationally. They wrote, the guests at the banquet, served in the roomy interior of the monster, will not soon forget their unique experience. Illuminated with tiny incandescent lights, tables laid with snowy linen and dainty china, the banquet room was as well appointed as the swellest cafe in the land. How did this come about? How did a whale become a touring attraction? It was due to a Captain Cott Plummer. He was born in Maine as Fernando Cortez Plummer, but went by Cott, and he lived most of his life in Texas. Now, the Plummer family, you may have heard of them. They have generations of seafaring captains in Maine and Texas. Both his father and his son were also pilots at Sabine Pass, and other family members were also involved in the maritime industry. Now, on March 8th, 1910, Captain Cott and his crew were attracted to these really huge splashes off in the distance, and they discovered a stranded whale in some mud shallows that were near Sabine Pass. There at the Texas-Louisiana border. The adult male sperm whale was stuck in about 14 feet of water, and he was lashing his tail in an attempt to free himself. And in this state, he would have been dangerous to approach. So Captain Cott waited until the whale was exhausted. Then he placed an 8-inch hawser around the whale. Hawsers were those really thick ship ropes. But the whale broke it. And he broke it on the next 3 attempts as well. Finally, a 10-inch hawser was secured, a secondary tugboat was engaged, and they worked in tandem to tow the whale 5 miles to Sabine Pass. It took them 5 hours, where the whale was secured in the water. Word of this capture traveled fast, because on the following day, spectators began arriving before Captain Plott had set up any sort of exhibition area. So he hastily charged them 50 cents. Visitors were very thrilled by the blow, and that's when the warm air comes out through the blowhole, and it looks like it's spraying water up into the air, and that occurred about every 15 minutes. Now, some of these visitors also tried to climb onto the whale's back. One of them almost slid into the water. By the end of that day, Captain Plummer had taken in more than $200 in ticket sales. But also, before the end of that day, he had made a deal with a Port Arthur Board of Trade to exhibit the whale in Port Arthur. The board became half owners. Captain Plummer and his brother Fred became the other owners. Now, this time they used 3 tugboats to move the whale to Port Arthur. After they arrived there, it was discovered the whale had perished during transit. So visitors are not going to be able to see the whale's spout anymore, but there is a plus to this. They can now exhibit it on land. So workmen began the process of digging an angular slope so that the whale could be winched up onto land. A fence and a platform were constructed, as well as a lighting system so people could see the whale at night. They opened up the abdominal cavity, shoved a bunch of ice in there, because when something starts to decay, it starts to smell. Press coverage is now national. For the next 2 to 3 weeks, it was unclear how long exactly it was exhibited there in Port Arthur. An estimated 20 to possibly 50,000 people came to see the whale, which became known as the Port Arthur whale. Here's a postcard. The visitor wrote, "This is the picture of the whale, 65 feet, 10 inches long. weigh 833,333 pounds, 12 feet thick. All well. Yours, Tom. Hotels were booked to capacity. Restaurants and food vendors ran out of food. Many visitors came by car, but many more came by train. So that Port Arthur Board of Trade had made a deal with the railroads. They would run advertisements, and the railroads would run excursions to Port Arthur from various cities in Texas and Louisiana, including Corpus Christi, Dallas, San Antonio, Texarkana, Baton Rouge, and New Orleans. The trains had to add extra carriages. But even so, people were left disappointed at their hometown depots because they could not get on the trains, which are said to be packed like sardines. Those who could not get a hotel room in Port Arthur had to go without sleep till they could get the train home. The first excursion train was said to have come in on March 13th with 2,000 school children from Beaumont. That is the most horrifying part of this story. All right. Among the visitors to the Port Arthur whale was a scientist from the University of Texas. He measured the whale, published a report. He said it was over 63 feet in length, had a tail width of 16 feet, and a snout height of over 10 feet. He noticed that when the whale was opened to be packed with ice, that the whale's lungs and stomach were filled with seaweed and mud, and he thinks that likely strangled the whale when it was moved from Sabine Pass to Port Arthur. Now, he suspected that this whale had probably once presided over a school of whales, but had been challenged and replaced by younger bulls. So he was wandering around by himself, probably chasing a school of squids or cuttlefish, but just got too close to the shore and became entangled in mud and debris. This turned out to be a very profitable venture. The Abilene Reporter wrote, "The lucky capture of the great sperm whale has been a bonanza to the owners and a source of wide advertisement for Port Arthur." The whale brought in $1 million to the merchants of Port Arthur and another $1 million to the railroads. Now, Captain Cott and his brother Fred received $1,000 for bringing the whale, but they also got a percentage of ticket sales. So everybody was making a lot of money. Captain Plummer formed the Mammoth Whale Company with the goal of mounting and displaying the whale, because inevitably the whale's decay became unavoidable. The Abilene Reporter wrote, "Fortunately, the strong odor near the whale was an incentive to see and leave. So the crowd in the enclosure constantly thinned, and returning trains carried them back. The limit of exhibition is rapidly nearing. Decomposition is rapidly occurring." And you can see in this photograph several people holding handkerchiefs up to their noses. Now, embalmers had come out. They had injected barrels of embalming fluid into this whale, but did not prevent the odor. The hide had been removed and mounted upon a framework to preserve its outline, but basically the whale had worn out its welcome. So Captain Plummer took the whale to Houston, and he displayed it on Buffalo Bayou at the foot of Travis Street. But people complained of the smell. So if the captain wanted to continue to display the whale, he was going to have to find a taxidermist. Now, fortunately, there was one in Harrisburg, in what's now East Houston, who was willing to do the job. And I suspected this idea was percolating in Captain Plummer's mind because he did something similar 11 years earlier. In 1899, he caught a monster sea fish measuring over 13 feet and weighing 1,000 pounds. He took it to a taxidermist and had it prepared, and he showed it at fairs in Dallas and San Antonio. All right, so this taxidermist, Robert George James, worked on the whale for 7.5 months for a cost of $5,000. He had a crew of 50 assistants. They stretched the skin out. They rendered barrels of sperm oil from the flesh. I read this one piece by an author who interviewed descendants of Mr. James. And they recalled that Mr. James's wife would not always allow him into the house after a day's work. All right, this was taking place during a Texas summer, and we all know what that's like. When he was finished, the preserved whale hide had been lined with hay, and the skeleton had been preserved separately for exhibition. Now, the Houston Chronicle wrote the whale had been hollowed out and fitted up with electric lights, rocking chairs, and window seats. and then moved onto that boat, the Olga, which we saw earlier. So the whale's ready for his second tour, just in time for the Notsuoh Carnival. And we have this ad here. Tomorrow is the last chance to see the mammoth whale. You owe it to your children to let them see this curiosity. Come down this afternoon or tomorrow. Open nights till 12. Adults, 25 cents. Children, 15 cents. Foot of San Jacinto Street. Well, the Houston Chronicle wrote, the last day of Carnival Week was a record breaker for the big whale. Hundreds of visitors on Saturday thronged the boat. The sight was one never seen in Houston before and was considered one of the leading features of Carnival Week. So Captain Plummer's made a lot of money. They planned to take it on tour to coastal cities, arranging to be in New Orleans during Mardi Gras. They would go up the Mississippi River and come down the Atlantic coast, making lots and lots of money, right? That was the idea, but new audiences were not as receptive. If anything, they were skeptical, and they suspected the hide had been stretched out to make it appear larger than it actually was. So the Mammoth Whale Company found the whale was no longer profitable. They sold it to an amusement park operator in Memphis, Tennessee, who displayed the whale in a tent near the banks of the Mississippi River. And reportedly, ice cream was sold from its interior. But this new iteration of the whale was short-lived. One night, the tent caught on fire. That whale was lined with straw, so everything went up in the fire. As for Captain Plummer, he caught another whale a little over 14 years later. Not much to find out about that story. It just, in the caption, says the monster weighs 90 tons and measured nearly 60 feet in length. The whale was found floundering in shallow water. But for the Houstonians who viewed the whale during the 1910 Notsuoh Carnival, the Houston Chronicle wrote, those who viewed the monster left the barge in wonderment, hardly believing that such a piece of animate matter could have been subdued by man. Those who saw the whale agree that book descriptions are altogether inadequate to convey a proper conception of the proportions of the monster. And thus ends our story of the time the Port Arthur whale came to Houston over 100 years ago. Okay, great.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Appreciate it.
Well, that was a whale of a story. Give us a couple minutes. We got a couple more presentations to get on the computer machine here, and we're going to be back in probably about 10 minutes with Philip Pyle 2. You don't want to miss that.